Willa Blaine found 3 Apache babies on her porch that morning, and someone had left them there on purpose. They were wrapped in torn blankets, clean and fed, but their eyes held the quiet exhaustion of children who had learned too early that crying brought no comfort. She stood in her doorway, rain dripping from her worn dress, studying these infants who barely stirred despite the storm. The oldest couldn't be more than 6 months, the smallest perhaps 3. Someone had traveled through dangerous territory during the worst weather in years to bring them here. But why her ranch? Why her? Willa had lived on this isolated property for 5 years since her husband died, barely scraping by on what little the land could provide. The nearest town was 2 days' ride, and most folks had forgotten this place even existed. She was the last person anyone would choose to care for 3 children. But tucked between the blankets, she found a small leather pouch containing more money than she'd seen in years. Not enough to raise 3 children properly, but enough to suggest that whoever left them here knew exactly how desperate her situation was. The coins were old, but real, and beneath them lay a single piece of paper with words written in shaky handwriting. Please, they deserve better than what we can give them. As Willa lifted the first baby, a girl with dark eyes that seemed to look right through her, one thought struck her with devastating clarity. Whoever left these children here knew she wouldn't turn them away. They had counted on her kindness, even though it might destroy her. She had no money, no help, and no idea how she would feed 3 growing children when she could barely feed herself. But as thunder rolled across the empty plains and rain hammered her roof, Willa Blaine made a choice that would define the next 23 years of her life. 23 years later, she would discover that the person who left them knew exactly what they were asking of her. And what those 3 children grew up to become would shock everyone who thought they understood what family really meant. The next morning brought a harsh reality that no amount of determination could soften. Willa stood in her empty kitchen, holding the smallest baby while the other 2 lay on blankets spread across her worn wooden table. The money from the pouch sat in neat piles before her, enough to buy supplies for maybe 2 months, if she stretched every penny. 3 babies needed milk, diapers, warm clothes, and medicine. Her own pantry held perhaps a week's worth of beans and stale bread. The roof leaked in 4 places, and winter was coming fast across the plains. "What am I going to do with you 3?" she whispered to the infant in her arms. The baby girl blinked up at her with those same dark, serious eyes that seemed far too aware for such a tiny face. Willa had spent the sleepless night trying to convince herself to ride to town and find someone else to take them. A church, perhaps, or a family with means. But every time she looked at these children, something in her chest tightened with a fierce protectiveness she couldn't explain. The sound of approaching horses made her freeze. Through her cracked window, she watched 3 men dismount near her broken fence. She recognized the leader, Marcus Brennan, who owned the largest ranch in the territory. His eyes swept over her property with the calculating look of a man considering a purchase. "Morning, Mrs. Blaine," Brennan called out, not bothering to remove his hat. "Heard you might be having some difficulties. Thought I'd ride out and make you an offer on this land." Willa stepped onto her porch, instinctively blocking his view into the house. "Not looking to sell, Mr. Brennan. Now that's unfortunate." His gaze lingered on the fresh tracks in the mud from yesterday's storm. "Seems like someone's been visiting. Hope you're not taking in strays you can't afford to feed." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Brennan had been pressuring her to sell for months, claiming her late husband owed him money she couldn't prove he didn't owe. Behind her, one of the babies began to cry, a thin, hungry sound that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Brennan's eyes sharpened with interest. "Sounds like you've got more mouths to feed than you can handle," he said, stepping closer. "My offer stands, Mrs. Blaine, but it won't stand forever." As his horses disappeared into the distance, Willa realized her choice was even starker than she'd thought. She could barely survive alone on this land. With 3 babies, survival seemed impossible. But something about the way Brennan had looked at her property The timing of his visit right after the children arrived made her wonder if their appearance here wasn't as random as she'd assumed. 2 weeks later, Willa faced a choice that would haunt her for years. The money was gone, spent on milk and basic supplies, and the babies were growing hungry again. Her own stomach cramped with emptiness as she watched them sleep in the wooden crates she'd converted into cribs. She'd named them quietly in her mind: Ayana for the oldest girl, Koa for the boy who rarely cried, and Nayeli for the smallest one who seemed to smile whenever Willa sang softly while working. But names wouldn't fill their bellies. The morning sun cast long shadows across her property as Willa hitched her dying horse to the old wagon. If she was going to keep these children alive, she needed to swallow her pride. The refuse pile behind Miller's general store might contain bottles, scrap metal, anything she could sell or trade. The ride to town felt endless, each bump in the rough trail a reminder of how far she'd fallen. Willa Blaine, who once hosted dinner parties for the territory's most prominent families, now rummaged through garbage like a scavenger. At the store's back alley, she found exactly what desperation looked like: broken furniture, bent nails she could straighten and sell, glass bottles that might bring a few cents each. She loaded her wagon methodically, ignoring the stares from passers-by who recognized her. "Well, look what we have here," a familiar voice called out. Sarah Hawkins, the banker's wife, stood at the alley's mouth with 2 other women from town. "I heard rumors, but I hardly believed them." Willa straightened, a rusted tin can still in her hands. "Mrs. Hawkins, is it true you're keeping Indian children out at your place?" Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge of judgment. "People are talking, Willa, saying you've lost your mind with grief." "Those children needed help," Willa replied quietly. "What they need is to be with their own kind," Sarah snapped. "And what you need is to stop this nonsense before you destroy what's left of your reputation." The other women nodded in agreement, their faces set with the cruel certainty of people who'd never faced true desperation. One of them whispered something about savaged children that made Willa's hands clench into fists. That night, as she counted the meager coins from selling her collection, Willa made a decision that would define everything that followed. She wouldn't just survive. She would prove that love could triumph over prejudice, that family was more than blood. But she had no idea that her choice to keep the children would set in motion events that someone had been planning for far longer than 23 years. 5 years had passed, and Willa's routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Every Tuesday and Friday, she loaded the 3 children into her patched wagon and made the journey to town. While other families shopped for luxuries, Willa searched through refuse piles, construction sites, and abandoned homesteads for anything with value. Ayana, now walking confidently at 5 years old, had learned to spot useful items with an expert eye. "Mama Willa, there's good metal under that pile," she would whisper, pointing to bent nails or broken tools that could be straightened and sold. Koa, quiet but observant at 4 years old, had developed an uncanny ability to find things others missed. Small coins dropped in the dirt, pieces of leather that could be mended, even the occasional piece of jewelry lost by careless travelers. Little Nayeli, barely 3, carried a small cloth bag and collected buttons, glass beads, and colorful scraps that seemed worthless, but often caught the eye of women looking for sewing materials. Their system worked, but barely. Each week brought enough money for basic food and essential supplies, leaving nothing for emergencies or improvements to their deteriorating property. The townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing them, though acceptance came slowly. Some still crossed the street when the children approached, muttering about Willa's charity cases, but others had begun to nod politely, especially after witnessing how well-behaved and intelligent the children were. That changed the day Marcus Brennan cornered them behind the blacksmith's shop. "Still playing house with those Indian brats, I see," he said, blocking their path to the wagon. His 2 ranch hands flanked him, hands resting casually on their gun belts. Willa instinctively moved the children behind her. "We're not looking for trouble, Mr. Brennan. Trouble's what you've got, whether you're looking for it or not." His eyes moved from child to child with calculating coldness. Word is, you've been teaching them to read. Teaching them things they don't need to know. Every child deserves an education, Willa replied firmly. Brennan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Education? For savages? That's dangerous thinking. Mrs. Blaine. Dangerous for everyone. Ayanna stepped forward before Willa could stop her. We're not bad people, the little girl said with quiet dignity that seemed beyond her 5 years. And learning isn't bad either. The silence that followed was deafening. Brennan's face darkened with rage at being challenged by a 5-year-old Apache child. His hand moved toward his weapon, and Willa's heart stopped. But Koa had already moved, positioning himself protectively in front of his sister while keeping his eyes locked on Brennan's hands. Even at 4 years old, the boy understood the threat they faced. Smart children make smart enemies, Brennan said finally. Remember that, Mrs. Blaine. Some debts take a long time to collect, but they always come due. As he walked away, Willa realized that her decision to educate the children had just made their situation far more dangerous than simple poverty ever could. 8 years into their life together, the children had become Willa's partners in survival rather than her burden. Ayanna, now 8, could repair almost anything with salvaged materials and showed remarkable intelligence for her age. Koa, 7, possessed a mathematical mind that could calculate the exact value of scrap metal before they even reached town. Nayeli, 6, had developed a talent for negotiation that often doubled their expected earnings. Their reputation in town had shifted dramatically. What began as pity had transformed into grudging respect. The family that survived on refuse had become the family that could fix what others couldn't, find what others had lost, and solve problems with creativity born from necessity. But Marcus Brennan's threats had never disappeared. If anything, they had grown more sophisticated. Property taxes mysteriously increased each year. Suppliers suddenly refused to sell to Willa at fair prices. Small sabotages appeared regularly. Fence posts loosened. Water troughs damaged. Essential tools mysteriously broken. The breaking point came on a bitter winter morning when Willa discovered their storage shed had been ransacked. Months of carefully collected materials lay scattered and destroyed in the snow. He's trying to starve us out, Ayanna said quietly, surveying the destruction. Her voice carried wisdom beyond her 8 years. Koa knelt beside a pile of ruined leather scraps they'd planned to sell. We can't keep playing defense forever, Mama Willa. We need a different strategy. What are you suggesting? Willa asked, though she feared the answer. Nayeli looked up from where she'd been examining the broken lock. We need help. Someone stronger than him. The suggestion hung in the cold air like a physical weight. This land was all Willa had left of her husband, the only home the children had ever known. But staying might mean watching them slowly starve or worse. That night, as they huddled around their small fire discussing possibilities, a stranger appeared at their door. He was an older man, well-dressed but travel-worn, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. Mrs. Blaine, my name is Thomas Crawford. I represent some educational interests back east. I've heard about your family's situation, and I'd like to make you an offer. Willa studied him suspiciously. What kind of offer? Educational opportunities for your children, full scholarships to excellent schools, room and board included. They're clearly exceptional young people. Ayanna exchanged glances with her siblings. What's the cost? Crawford smiled at her directness. Smart girl. The cost is 15 years. They study, they learn, they grow into the people they're meant to become. And when they're ready, they come home. Why? Koa asked. Why would anyone invest in us? Crawford's expression grew serious. Because someone believes that what you do with knowledge and opportunity matters more than where you come from. And because sometimes, the debts we think we owe aren't the debts that actually matter. His words echoed strangely in Willa's mind, but she couldn't place why. All she knew was that her children deserved better than this endless struggle against a man determined to destroy them. The morning the children left, Willa thought her heart might actually break. 15 years felt like a lifetime. but she knew this opportunity would give them everything she never could. Ayanna stood tall beside the wagon, trying to appear brave even as tears streamed down her 8-year-old face. "We'll write every week," she promised, though they all knew letters would be rare and precious. Koa handed Willa a small wooden carving he'd made, a horse with 3 riders. "So you don't forget us," the 7-year-old said quietly. Nayeli simply threw her arms around Willa's waist and held on until Thomas Crawford gently suggested it was time to leave. At 6 years old, she was barely able to understand what was happening. "Remember," Willa whispered to each of them, "you are my children in every way that matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." As the wagon disappeared into the distance, Willa stood alone on her property for the first time in over 10 years. The silence felt deafening. The years that followed tested every ounce of strength she possessed. Without the children's help, collecting refuse became backbreaking work. Her aging body protested each trip to town, each heavy load of scrap metal and salvaged materials. Marcus Brennan intensified his pressure, sensing her vulnerability. Property taxes doubled, then tripled. Essential repairs became impossible to afford. Her once sturdy house began showing signs of serious decay. But Willa persevered, driven by the knowledge that somewhere far away, 3 remarkable young people were learning and growing into everything they were meant to become. Letters arrived sporadically, each one treasured and read, until the paper grew soft from handling. Ayanna wrote about studying medicine and engineering. Koa described his fascination with law and business. Nayeli shared her passion for teaching and social reform. The children were thriving, but their success came at a cost Willa felt in her bones every day. On her 60th birthday, alone except for the memories that filled every corner of her property, Willa received an unexpected visitor. An elderly Apache woman appeared at her door, her weathered face kind but serious. "You are the one who took in the children," she said without preamble. "I am," Willa replied, studying the woman's face for clues about her purpose. "My name is Elena. I was asked to check on your welfare. The children's benefactor wanted to ensure you were managing." "Benefactor?" Willa's pulse quickened. "I thought Mr. Crawford represented Eastern business interests." Elena's smile was enigmatic. "He does. But the interests involved are more personal than business. You raised 3 children who were not your blood, sacrificed everything for their welfare. Some people believe such debts should be honored." "What debts?" "I chose to keep them. No one forced me. Sometimes the most important debts are the ones we create through love," Elena said softly. "In 8 more years, when they return, you will understand what I mean." As Elena walked away, Willa felt a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. 8 more years seemed both endless and terrifyingly short. 23 years after finding 3 babies on her porch, Willa Blaine faced her final defeat. The notice of foreclosure sat on her kitchen table like a death sentence, official stamps marking the end of everything she'd fought to preserve. Her hands, now gnarled with arthritis, shook as she read the document for the 10th time. Marcus Brennan had finally won. Unpaid taxes, accumulated interest, and legal fees had created a debt impossible for a 67-year-old woman surviving on refuse collection to pay. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tomorrow marked exactly 23 years since she'd found the children. If they kept their promise to return, they would arrive to find her packing the last remnants of the only home they'd ever known. A knock at her door interrupted her bitter thoughts. Through the cracked window, she saw Brennan himself, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits, lawyers no doubt, come to witness her surrender. "Mrs. Blaine," Brennan said as she opened the door, "I trust you've reviewed the documents. My wagon will be here in the morning to help you relocate." "Relocate where?" Willa asked wearily. "The poorhouse? That's not my concern. You've had decades to accept reasonable offers. Now circumstances have made the choice for you." One of the lawyers stepped forward with additional papers. "These documents transfer ownership effective immediately. You have until sunset to remove your personal belongings." Willa stared at the papers without really seeing them. After everything, the years of back-breaking work, the sacrifices, the determination to prove that love could triumph over prejudice. It had all been for nothing. "There is one small matter," Brennan continued, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "My records show that some years ago, you harbored 3 Apache children illegally, children whose tribal affiliation was never properly documented. They were abandoned," Willa said sharply. "I saved their lives. That's debatable. But should they ever return to this territory, I want it clearly understood that they are not welcome. This land now belongs to me, and I decide who sets foot on it." As the men walked away, Willa sank into her chair and let the tears come freely for the first time in years. She had failed, not just herself, but the 3 children who had called her mother. They would return to find nothing, no home, no family, no sign that their years of love and struggle had mattered. The sun was setting when she heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, moving fast across the plains toward her property. Her heart lurched with hope and terror. Were her children coming home just in time to witness her final humiliation? Or was Brennan returning with more men to ensure she left without causing trouble? As the riders drew closer, Willa realized that after 23 years of wondering what their reunion would look like, she was about to find out in the worst possible circumstances. 3 riders emerged from the dust, and Willa's heart nearly stopped. The woman leading them sat tall in her saddle, her long black hair braided with silver threads, wearing a fine wool coat that spoke of success and prosperity. But her eyes, those same dark, intelligent eyes, belonged to Ayanna. Behind her rode 2 men, one tall and broad-shouldered with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect, the other leaner but carrying himself with quiet authority. Koa and Nayeli, grown into adults she barely recognized yet knew instantly. "Mama Willa," Ayanna said, dismounting with fluid grace. "We're home." The years had transformed them into people of obvious education and means, but when they embraced her, they were still her children. Willa felt 15 years of loneliness melt away in their arms. "You're just in time to see me lose everything," she said through her tears. "Brennan foreclosed today. I have until sunset to leave." Koa studied the legal documents with professional interest. Foreclosure based on accumulated taxes and interest. Standard predatory practice. His voice carried the measured tone of someone trained in law. "Tell me, did Brennan ever provide proper documentation of the original debt he claimed our father owed?" "There never was any documentation," Willa said. "He simply claimed it existed." Nayeli smiled, the same sweet expression she'd worn as a child, but now backed by adult confidence. "Then we have grounds to challenge this entire proceeding." "With what money?" Willa asked. "I can't afford lawyers." "You don't need to," Ayanna said, producing an envelope thick with official papers. "We do. I graduated from medical school and engineering college. I own 3 hospitals back east. Koa finished law school and business college. He's partners in one of the largest trading companies in the territory. Nayeli completed teacher's college and social reform training. She's opened schools for Native children across 5 states. Willa stared at them in amazement. "How is that possible? The scholarships couldn't have covered everything." "They didn't," Koa said. "We worked. We studied. We built our own success. But more importantly, we never forgot what you taught us about fighting for what's right." "There's something else you need to know," Ayanna said gently. "The man who funded our education wasn't a stranger. Thomas Crawford was your late husband's business partner. Your husband invested in Eastern trading routes before he died. Those investments grew over 23 years. "That's impossible," Willa whispered. "He died penniless. He died before his investments matured," Nayeli explained. "Crawford managed them honorably all these years. Your husband's share is now worth enough to buy half the territory. It legally belongs to you, and it always has." The sound of approaching wagons interrupted their reunion. Marcus Brennan had returned with men to oversee Willa's eviction, but now he would face 3 successful adults who had spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment. Marcus Brennan's confident expression faltered when he saw the three well-dressed adults standing beside Willa. His eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "The Indian children," he said with undisguised hatred. "I warned you they weren't welcome here." "Mr. Brennan," Koa said, stepping forward with legal documents in hand, "I'm afraid there's been a significant error in your foreclosure proceedings. This property was never legally yours to claim." Brennan laughed harshly. "That old woman hasn't paid taxes in years. The debt is legitimate." "The debt may be real," Ayanna interjected, "but your authority to collect it isn't. This land belongs to the Blaine estate, which includes substantial Eastern investments that have been generating income for over 2 decades. Nayeli produced a thick folder of financial records. Income that more than covers any accumulated taxes, with considerable surplus remaining. Furthermore," Koa continued, his lawyer's training evident in every word, "your claim that my father owed you money has never been substantiated with proper documentation. In fact, our investigation reveals that you owe the Blaine estate significant money for cattle purchases made 24 years ago." Brennan's face reddened with rage. "This is fraud. You can't just manufacture debts and investments." "We're not manufacturing anything," Ayanna said calmly, producing official bank documents sealed with territorial stamps. "These investments and records have been maintained by Crawford and Associates for over 2 decades. Everything is properly documented and legally binding." The lawyers Brennan had brought examined the documents with growing dismay. One whispered urgently in his ear before stepping back with obvious reluctance. "The paperwork appears to be in order," the lawyer said reluctantly. "Mrs. Blaine's claim to this property is secure, and there are indeed significant assets that invalidate the foreclosure." But Ayanna wasn't finished. "There's more, Mama Willa. We've spent 15 years not just building our own success, but investigating every injustice Brennan committed against families like ours. We have documented evidence of fraudulent foreclosures, intimidation tactics, and illegal land seizures affecting over 30 families." "What does that mean?" Willa asked, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what her children had accomplished. Koa smiled. "It means Mr. Brennan is facing federal charges for fraud and extortion. His entire empire was built on stolen land and forged documents." Nayeli addressed Brennan directly. "The families you destroyed deserve justice. We've spent years gathering evidence, and today we're filing charges with the territorial marshal." As federal marshals rode up to arrest Brennan, Willa finally understood the true scope of what her children had done. They hadn't just returned successful, they had returned as agents of justice for everyone Brennan had wronged. "But how?" Willa whispered as Brennan was led away in chains. Ayanna took her hands gently. "You taught us that family isn't about blood, it's about love and sacrifice. You collected trash to feed us, so we collected evidence to protect you. You gave us everything when you had nothing. Now we're giving you everything we've built." 23 years after 3 abandoned babies had changed her life, Willa Blaine discovered that love truly does return multiplied, and justice sometimes takes decades to arrive, but never forgets those who deserve it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.